Hello guys, welcome back. So today we're going to take some time to go through a purchase agreement. Buying a property is a big deal and there's a lot of hassle involved in terms of legalities. So what I want to do with you today is just take some time and to step you through the articles. Now on average, every purchase agreement is nearly the same. They will have about 20 articles and it sounds a lot more difficult than it really is. So let us take some time to step through what they actually mean. So in a minute, I will switch to my screen and I will step you through them. Bear with me. Now I hope that you guys can read this all right. As you can see, this is a standard purchase agreement from the NVM, as you can see with this logo here on the right. The NVM is the Dutch Association of Real Estate Agents, and because we are listed with them, we use their contracts. First page is all the parties that are involved in buying or selling the property. So here on A are the sellers. All the details should be registered and entered, and the buyers as well. So on the first page, you will find the details of the buyers and the sellers that are entering into an agreement. Always make sure that you double check your own details with care because it's important that they are all correct. Scrolling down to Article 1. Sale and purchase. So here it states the concerning address. Now, as you know, here in the Netherlands, all properties are listed in the kadaster. And the kadaster is a database where all plots and all properties are listed and also listed who owns these properties. Now, they're not listed in the kadaster as an address, but they are listed as a plot number and an area number. So it might look a little bit weird, but that's just the way that it's registered in the kadaster. It also tells how many square meters there are, and not completely unimportant is the purchase price. Then we go to article number 2. First, it states that the buyer is responsible for all costs involved in the purchase. Now, here in the Netherlands, we call that kostenkoper. And what that basically means is that all the costs that are involved in transferring the property from the seller to the buyer, they are for the buyer. Now, on average, these costs, and we've covered this in previous articles, you should be looking at your transfer tax, the cost of the notary, you'll have to have an official appraisal, all those costs. You're looking at, on average, about 5% of the purchase price. The buyer here in the Netherlands has the right to appoint a notary. Now, there is a rare occasion where if you're buying from a large investment company, that they will have a set notary. But, in the most cases, you can appoint a notary and do this with your purchase agent. They are happy to help you in any case. Article 2.2. If the property changed ownership in the last 6 months, the tax authorities will refund the previous transfer tax. And that's not to you, but that is to the buyer. Article 3. I'll scroll it up a little bit higher. All cash flows, they will go through the notary. So the notary is the one that is transferring all amounts. The buyer will have to pay things like transfer tax, all those things, and they will be settled when you go to the notary and you will sign the official deed. So the notary will hold these funds in a special third-party account. Think of the 10% of the purchase price, that deposit that will be paid by the buyer in advance. So these costs will be settled when you sign the official deed when you go to the notary. Article 4. the transfer of ownership. Now it states on which date the ownership will transfer to the buyer. So on that date, you will actually receive the keys. And that's when the ownership transfers to you as well. It also states that this date may be changed if the buyer and seller both agree. Now, we often see that when people purchase a newly built project, sometimes, they can be delayed, and it happens, and then they really can't do anything about it. But, if you're a renter and you're quite flexible in changing that date, then just make sure that you mention that to the seller. And in many cases, you can alter the date that you both agreed upon. Article 5, bank guarantee, deposit. The buyer must always pay a deposit, and it can be done from either their savings or from a bank guarantee. Now, on average, this is about 4 to 6 weeks after signing your purchase agreement. And, it's safe to state that on average, this is about 10% of the purchase price, but we'll come back to that in Article 11, I believe, at a later stage. Article 6, the condition of the property. In Article 6.1, this is the article specifically aimed at the buyer. So the article actually tells the buyer that it is his responsibility to know what he's buying. He signs that the property is transferred in the state in which he can now find himself, but also with all rights, entitlements, everything that is included with that. So that may include that you need to maybe allow a neighbor to walk on your land. If that was an agreement that was made in the past and that is listed in the cadastre, that means that now you accept that also applies to you. So sometimes that also includes an obligation. So it could be, for instance, that you're not allowed to paint your window frames in a different color. Or sometimes it can actually include that you're not allowed to sell the property to anyone else than the person that you are buying the property from. So always make sure that you double check that Article 6.1. Article 6.3. This article states that the property must be suitable for normal use. So think of, for instance, toilets. They must be flushed properly. And hot water and heating must work, and there must be no serious leakage. Article 6.4. A statement from the seller whether or not there is a contamination in the property, things like asbestos or underground oil tanks in the garden, or that the soil is contaminated. Now, we've seen this happening a really long time ago when, with older properties, probably from the 1900s, 1930s, maybe 1940s. And this would happen in the area of Den Haag, where, people had big oil tanks in the backyard, and that was for their central heating. Now, in many cases, those oil tanks, they leaked, and so you'll have contaminated soil. So it's really important to double check this article. Article 6.5. The buyer always has the right to inspect the property one last time before going to the notary. Now, usually this will happen on the same day that you receive the keys, unless you have a very early appointment. So say, for instance, the notary only has time on a Friday and it's going to be 8:30 a.m. In that case, often the end inspection, the final inspection, will be on the Thursday afternoon. Now, if you have a purchase agent, they will be present as well. The selling agent will be present, the buyer and the seller will be there. If for some reason that property doesn't present in the way that you both agreed upon, say for instance, there is a door and it has a hole in it or something else is wrong, don't sign the agreement. Don't go to the notary until that issue is settled. Because as soon as you signed the agreement, It's legally binding and it legally states that the property is okay. Then we go to Article 6.6. This is a statement from the seller whether or not the government has issued a notice to the owner to improve items in the property. So at all stages, you need to make sure that the upkeep of the property is done in a good manner. And sometimes the government can actually make sure that you upgrade some items or they need improvement. Article 6.7. So if the property is a monument, it will be stated here. And it is important to remember that in such case, it's not always easy to make changes to a home. You know, if some properties are on a monumental list, in many cases they have to remain in the state that they are. You can't upgrade or modernize any features of the property. So always make sure that you're well informed with this article. Article 6.8. A statement from the seller that he has not agreed to sell the property to anyone else. So what could happen is, for instance, let me think of an example. If he maybe has given the option to purchase the property to a neighbor in the past, and he has a WhatsApp message and it states, you know, in a couple of years ago, he decided to sell the property. You know, if he was ready to ever sell the property, that he would sell it to the neighbor. Then that would tie that neighbor legally to the property. But this article says that by signing this document, that the seller has agreed that he hasn't promised the property to anyone else. Article 6.9, another statement from the seller that in no case there is a claim on the property from the government for plans on the land. Now, in some cases we see this where the government actually wants to maybe build a highway or has different plans for a property. And what they do is then they appoint that property and purchase that property from the owner. They pay good money for it, the actual value of the property. But in that case, the government has more right to the property and they claim it and they buy it, and then you actually can't buy it anymore. Article 6.2. If there are tenants in the property, they may still be allowed to remove things from the property if they are vacating. Now, that obviously doesn't include any of the list of item things, you know, that is mentioned in this whole purchase process. If things are removed that were part of the property, then you should definitely mention that in that last inspection. But yeah, in many cases, a property is sold that tenants used to live in, and then they still have the right to remove their personal items and belongings. Article 6.11. This states that the property was measured by a professional, but if there is any chance that the property is stated, for instance, as listed as 100 square meters, but is in reality only 95 square meters, then the buyer cannot be, the seller cannot be held liable. You know, there is a certain government rule that we have to use to measure properties, and it's always done professionally, but you can't make any claims afterwards, after buying the property, if you remeasure that property and it turns out that they were off a couple of square meters. Article 6.12. If a ground lease applies, then the seller always declares to have paid his annual fees for this. And they will have to state that, because in many cases you can actually own a house, but you can't own the soil. Now here in Brabant, in this area, that's very uncommon. It could happen still, but you know, that should always be very clear before you purchase a property and in this article. Article 6.13. If the seller states that he's not aware of certain things that are in the property, but it turns out that they really were present, this states that he can be held liable. And a good example for this is, for instance, if the seller has stated that there's no asbestos in the property, but then the buyer has bought the property and it turns out a construction company went through the property and they did find asbestos, then you can still hold the seller liable. And often we can see those extra clauses like asbestos, that they are added into a purchase agreement just to make sure, that a seller can't be held liable. Asbestos are used in many occasions. They were used in the past, especially with older style properties. And, you should think of insulation material, in some cases in flooring, fireplaces, because of it doesn't burn easily. We can see that in a lot of sheds in the backyard. It's still used in roofing. Older style properties, probably older than 2000, this could definitely be included in the purchase agreement. Article 7.1, so the actual transfer. 7.1, it states that the transfer of ownership happens with the transfer of the keys. So when you receive the keys at the notary. 7.2, so at the time of the ownership, the seller will need to make sure that the property is neat, is cleaned, and is emptied. And obviously leave the items in the property that you both agreed upon on the purchase. Article 7.3. Once the purchase agreement has been signed, the seller may not simply put tenants in the property or enter into a lease agreement for the property unless he has received permission to do so from the buyer. So this is really important, because under Dutch law, the tenant is always protected. And if the seller would actually put a tenant in there, it's very hard to get that tenant out. But if he signs this document, he then automatically states that he hasn't rented it out. Article 4.7. It may very well be, that there are certain guarantees or warranties in the property. It might be for instance, a new dishwasher or floor insulation or, any other warranty. Or it might be a newer property that the whole property is still under warranty. Warranties and guarantees, they are always connected to the property. So they are never connected to a person, but always connected to a property. So they will then transfer to the buyer. Now, in that case, it's obviously very handy to make sure that you have any certificates that, that apply to this. But always double check. Article 8. Benefits, liabilities, and ground rent or ground lease. This article actually says that from the day of the transfer of the keys, the buyer is responsible for council, the taxes, ground rent, and any other levies. So if there's any outstanding fees, then he will have to make sure that they are paid. So at the moment when you go to the notary and when you sign and everything is official and you transfer the keys, like we discussed in Article 3, all cash flows, they will go through the notary, through that third-party account. So in this case, in Article 8, the notary will calculate all of the exact amounts and make sure that all the amounts are settled. And everyone will receive an invoice at that stage. Article 9, joint and severe liabilities. So you often buy or sell something together with your partner. This article actually regulates that after you've signed, you have authorized each other to fulfill the rights and obligations of the agreement, stating that you are both 100% responsible for the property. So not 50-50, but for the full 100%. Article 10. So up to the moment of transfer of ownership, the sellers are responsible for all the risks and damages that may occur to the property. So this is from a broken dishwasher to a fallen tree on the property or anything else that you might think of. So the sellers, they have to repair or replace the damage that occurs into the house. So say, for instance, that dishwasher has broken. You've purchased that property. And, you let the sellers know that dishwasher was actually broken, and you then decide that you replace that dishwasher and you give him an invoice for it. That actually doesn't apply. You have to allow him in a reasonable amount of time to actually bring the property back in the state that you both agreed upon. So he will then have to either buy a new dishwasher or one that is equally good. So if it's a dishwasher that's 5 years old, then he's more than welcome to purchase one from Facebook, from someone else, and then provide that to you. Article 11, Notice of Default, Cancellation. So this article regulates under penalty of a proper fine that the parties comply with their obligation. Obviously, you're in a legally binding contract, and if you don't hold up your end of the agreement, that actually incurs quite a big fine. So as a buyer, you have two main obligations, and that is to take the property and to pay. And if you fail to do so, then the other party has the right to demand a certain amount of money. So, it talks about that 10%. That's absolutely the maximum amount. But say, for instance, when the buyer doesn't show up at the notary, he's in direct default, and then per day, he can be charged 3 promille from the purchase price per day. Now, up until 10 days, and then you've reached the 10% of the purchase, and then you get to the next step. The seller will soon have to state, that they will have to then send a letter to make sure that the buyer knows that they are in direct default. And the notary will always settle those costs, so you don't have to worry about it. Now, if the seller doesn't hold up their part of the agreement, so if they decided that they no longer want to sell the property to you, they are obviously in direct default as well. So you, as the buyer, can let them know that they are in direct default, and they also have to hold up their end of the agreement. If they don't do that, also they can be fined. Article 12, and I'll just scroll through this quite quickly because there's a numerous amount of information in this, and I'll just go back to the very basis that you'll need. Otherwise, we'll still be here tomorrow morning. Article 12, addresses for service. So the sales contract and all the important correspondence will be filed with the notary at the office. So if for some reason some party, the seller or the buyer, is very difficult to reach, they might be overseas or something, or in a hospital, all communication legally you can go through the notary. They will always be the legal party involved in this, and they are always happy to communicate. Article 13, registration of the sales contract. Now, by law, you have the right to list this agreement in the cadastre. Now, again, the cadastre is the area where the database where all the contracts are listed. All the Dutch addresses, all the properties, all the plot numbers are listed in the cadastre. By law, after signing the purchase agreement, the notary will actually list the property in the cadastre. Now, in some cases, if you have any doubts that something might happen to the property before, between signing the provisional deed and going to the notary, you can choose to have that agreement listed in the cadastre earlier. Now, the cost for that, on average, between 150 to 200 euros. And, you got to think to yourself, why would I choose to have that listed in the cadastre before the actual transfer date? If you are aware that the seller is in financial problems, or, they might go bankrupt, it might be a very good idea to have this property listed in the cadastre earlier. Because the bank always is the most powerful, they will take possession of the house, and therefore you do not have a sale. So say, for instance, if you're worried that the seller might sell the property to someone else in the meantime, you could have this listed in the cadastre as well. or if, for instance, there is a legal conflict. You're not sure how it's going to end up. They might have a lot of debt. Someone might take possession of the house. Registration is always possible, and you as the buyer always have the right to list the property in the kadaster, and the maximum period for that is 6 months, so be mindful. Then we go to Article 14, identities, really important. You're not purchasing or selling a bag of marbles, I always say. So at all times, it's important that all parties involved must be able to identify themselves to each other. You could always ask the buyer, can you please show identification? At the notary, it's always mandatory to identify yourself as well. Also very important, and this is just information in between, it's not actually listed in the contract, but when you go to the notary's office and you are signing the deed and the transfer is done at that time, and you're actually not from this country, but you can sort of make yourself a little bit understandable. You can speak slightly Dutch. Always make sure that there is a translator involved, and that there is cost for that. But Dutch law states that you have to fully understand what you're signing because it is a legally binding contract. But talk to your financial advisor. They would be able to help you with this. Article 15. So Article 15 goes in depth about all the terms and conditions that you've made your bid on, for instance. So what we see happening a lot is where you make an offer for a property and you say, well, I want to purchase the property, but I'm not sure if I can actually get a mortgage. So in that case, you would say, I'm offering an X amount under the reservation of getting a finance. Now, in this article, it would then state the maximum amount that you would need a mortgage for, and also the time frame, the period in which that you need to arrange this mortgage. If you are not able to get a mortgage, then you always need to you need to show. So you need to be able to show something in writing that you're not able to get a mortgage. Otherwise, you need to pay that 10% deposit. Something else that might be part of the agreement, might be part of the terms and conditions, is, for instance, a technical building inspection. Say, for instance, you want to purchase an older property from the 1900s, early 1900s, and you've done a technical building inspection, and you've said, the mandate that I'm setting has to be 10K. If it's over 10K, then I want to void the sale. And the inspector's gone to the property and they then notice that the roof is completely rotten or something is wrong with the pure foundation of the property. You can then actually walk away from the sale without any repercussions, without any fines, and you'll get that 10% deposit back. Oftentimes you'll get this bouwkundige keuring, this technical building inspection. You'll have that done before signing the provisional deed or within that 3 days cooling off period. Article 16. So by Dutch law, you have the right as a buyer to change your mind for 3 days. So the way it works is, say for instance that you've bought a property today, that time starts at midnight tonight. So that means a full day on the Friday. The weekend counts as one full day. And so then you'll have the time to change your mind until Monday midnight. After that, you are tied legally in this agreement. Now, very interesting to know is that the seller actually doesn't have that 3 days cooling off period. It's just for the buyer. Article 17, written form of requirement. A verbal agreement is no agreement, really. So this agreement becomes factual as soon as both parties have signed. Article 18, really short, really strong. Because we are in the Netherlands, Dutch law always applies to our contracts. Article 19, so this will usually state all the attachments that have been sent with the actual contract. So, think of, for instance, the list of items, energy label, all those type of things as well. And you need to make sure that when you're signing the contract, the agreement, that you also sign them. Article 20 just leaves some room to, if you've made any agreements. I don't even think it's in here. Yeah, so special additional agreements. So for instance, I've come across cases where people said, is it okay if I leave my outside dining table in the backyard? Those type of things. And you both agreed upon it. You're both fine with it. You can include that in the contract here in Article 20. All right, so that was it, guys. I hope this was really helpful. If you know anyone that is going through this process and could really benefit from some explanation, make sure you tag them, make sure you share it. If there's any other things that you're struggling with and you really would like to have some more information, you know where to find us. We're always happy to help. So thanks again for watching. I really appreciate your time, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks.